hello. My name is Catherine Dignazio, and I just want to introduce our short paper, Feminicide and Machine Learning, Detecting Gender-Based Violence to Strengthen Civil Sector Activism. And we're a collaboration between three groups: the Data Plus Feminism Lab at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where I'm a professor, the Iniciativa Latinoamericana de Datos Abiertos in Latin America and the Caribbean, and Feminicidio Uruguay, based in Uruguay and represented by Helena Suarez. And then I just want to acknowledge the work of many folks who are not going to be speaking today, including Cruxen, Wonyoung, and Angeles Martinez, and Mariel Garcia-Montes in this work. And so now I will turn it over to Silvana from the organization ILDA.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to share our work with all of you, wherever you are in different parts of the world, I assume. I'm Silvana Fumega. I'm the Research and Policy Director of ILDA, as Catherine mentioned before. And I'll briefly introduce the object and background of this current project on AI and feminicide in partnership with the Data Plus Feminism Lab and Feminicide Uruguay. Basically, we understand feminicide as the murder of a woman because they are women, whether it is committed within a family, a domestic partnership, or any other interpersonal relationship, or by anyone in the community, or whether it's perpetrated or tolerated by the state or its agents. This is a definition that is taken from a document in 2008 of the of the follow-up mechanisms of the Belém do Pará Convention. In Latin America, in particular, the discussion of this phenomenon has led to make it visible and to pose it as a problem that challenges societies and governments. However, these visibility exercises had not found a correlation in the improvement of the official registration systems of these crimes. So just in a nutshell, I could say that what we know is that approximately 3,529 women in the region were victims of feminicide in 2018, according to the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. However, the number is slightly higher. And why is that? Because one of the main reasons is that even though these regional exercises collecting data from different governments in Latin America and the Caribbean are very valuable, the main limitation is that they depend on the data that each government produces and sends. And this presents a problem not only because of the quality of the data, but also because in many cases, legislation only accounts for a small portion of the problem. That is that the murder of a woman by a partner or ex-partner, so what we usually call intimate feminicide. So the problem is that if we don't know exactly the problem we are facing, we can't really think about the best solutions and design strong public policies to try to solve it. And that's why about 3 years ago, with ILDA, the organization I belong to, we decided to work on a regional, meaning Latin America and the Caribbean, a standardization of data on feminicide, focusing in particular on the official data on these crimes. So feminicide data is complex. Many factors define feminicide, and that is one of the reasons why it's necessary to standardize this data. And basically, why standardization? Because at ILDA we think that standardization processes force organizations to think about the type of data they need, they collect, how they store it, and eventually how they use it. So in terms of this particular project, we are currently in our 3rd year. We are working with several countries, several governments in Latin America. And this was basically, a conversation about this project was basically the basis for this current collaboration that we are having with these other 2 organizations, the Data Plus Feminism Lab and Feminicide Uruguay. So I'm gonna let now my colleagues to discuss the current project in a few minutes upon these concepts that I briefly try to explain. So Catherine, I'm not sure who is next.
Great, thanks. Next up is Helena from Feminicidio Uruguay.
Thank you, Silvana. Thank you, Catherine. So my name is Helena Suarez. I am an activist and researcher from Uruguay, and I've been taking forward a project called Feminicidio Uruguay as an independent as an independent activist since 2015, where I've been recording cases of feminicide. The reason I started doing it is the same reason why several activists in the region started doing similar projects. As Silvana has outlined, data from governments is lacking, is inadequate often, or not easily available, and most importantly is underreported. And because of sometimes because of the constraints that Silvana has outlined in terms of the legal frameworks in which this data, official data, are collected, but sometimes because of specific gender limitations that mean that these data are not considered important or not considered important enough to gather. So because of that, feminist activists in the region have been collecting data since the 80s and the 90s. Started off as manual efforts using spreadsheets, faxes, and all sorts of different interventions. But most recently, there's been a series of efforts like mine using tools such as Google Spreadsheets and Maps and Mapbox infograms. So starting to use the digital tools available for data collection and visualization. The focus of most of these works, like mine, are either national level, but sometimes they're focusing on a city or on a particular region. And most of them are based on media monitoring. So the work that I do is I have Google Alerts that tells me whenever there's a news report that mentions certain keywords related to feminicide. And from that Google Alert, I look at the reports, I seek other reports until I find all data. I use some of the definitions that Silvana outlined in order to make a decision whether this whether a case should be categorized as feminicide or not. And then I add this to my database. And several activists across the region work in a similar way, and also outside the region as well. These data are used by activists as a tool to generate awareness, to make the issue most visible. And often we use this data to circulate it on social media, to work with families of victims, or to lobby governments as well. But this work has several challenges. Practically, one of the challenges is actually finding the information. As I mentioned, this, we often use Google Alerts or Google searches or other search engine results, and these can return several cases that are not feminicide. So you end up with an overload of reading material that is related to extreme violence that you have to kind of sift through in order to find the cases that are belonging to the category. The other flip side of that is that we are basing most of this data collection on media reports, which are often inaccurate, sexist, transphobic, or racist, or all the other kind of stereotypes and discriminations that you can imagine. So we have to read between the lines of a lot of this information in order to give the data a gender perspective. Another challenge is capacity. Like myself, most volunteers, most feminist activists doing this work are volunteers. I don't get paid to do this work. I started it as a personal initiative, as part of my activism in the movement. And doing this tool, you know, learning how to use the tools. Some activists also are doing freedom of information access requests, or, you know, doing different kind of ways to improve the data, further searches, training capacity. All of this takes time, and as well as money, which is not easily available. And the third challenge is the emotional challenge. As I mentioned, we are often reading case upon case of murder and murder and murder, or murder attempts. Not always feminicide, but for all of those cases, you invest a certain amount of care. Not only on the cases of feminicide, but all the cases that you're reading about, you're holding them in your hearts in some way. And in particular, the databases become these databases of care that most activists are very familiar with in an intimate way. And so we have this kind of very emotional connection to the data. So the project that we're developing now is trying to address some of these challenges that feminist activists face on this work. And I'm gonna let my colleagues continue with the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Helena. So in Lauren Klein and I's recent book, which is called Data Feminism, we talk about feminicide as this case of missing data. So like Silvana was saying, the data are not collected by the state, or they're not collected with rigorous enough sort of high quality data. And this activist monitoring of feminicide represents one way to challenge that missing data. So it's a powerful example of feminist counter data collection. Yet at the same time, as Helena is talking about, activists face a great many challenges in doing this work. So when we all came together, it led us to ask this more kind of socio-technical design research question, which is here on the slide. What are ways that AI and machine learning can support and sustain civil society's efforts to collect feminicide data? And thus far from our interviews and our co-design sessions with activists, and here I want to do a quick shout out to Don Wilcox of Women Count USA, who's in the audience today. What we've started doing is this idea of building a machine learning model to help classify news articles with the probability that they are a case of feminicide or not. Because almost all of the activists we've interviewed use news media as a source of cases for their database. And as Helena was saying, they're pouring long hours over news articles that may or may not be actually relevant for including in the database. So it's this idea of sort of reducing the amount of that information that they have to scan and improving the quality of that information, and reducing the time, since activists are very time constrained. So we've been exploring this idea of training a model to detect feminicide, as well as building a tool to help surface the most likely cases of feminicide to the forefront of activists' limited attention. And then just one thing I want to say about the work that's important to know is that the work is not about automating feminicide detection for a central authority. Just like the last keynote speaker mentioned, it's not about full automation. This is very much about supporting and sustaining the humans undertaking this labor, who are doing the labor in very hostile conditions. And so now, oh wait, no, I have one more slide and then I'm going to turn it to Harini. So first, of course, what we had to do is to collect a data set. There is no existing data set of news articles that are labeled as feminicide or not. So we created one. The overall methodology we describe in the paper, but basically we collected a set of news articles about women's murders. Then we labeled the news articles with multiple human annotators. And here on the slide, you can see our categories that we used. And then thirdly, where there were discrepancies, human discrepancies, we resolved those with discussion and expert consultation. And just a quick shout out to the Media Cloud platform here, because they've been a really essential partner for us to be able to query and process news article data at scale and across geographies as well. So these articles were labeled by 3 people independently. We used ILDA's definition of feminicide, which follows the UN Latin American Model Protocol. And then we would do like a discussion and relabeling event when we didn't agree with each other. And so as you can see in this table, there's sort of feminicide kind of like that, but then there's several subcategories of feminicide that we discuss in the paper, such as trans feminicide or feminicide of sex workers, and so on. And then there is this case of not enough information. And this is when a media article doesn't contain enough information for a human being to make a judgment about whether this was a case of feminicide or not. And so here I want to just pass to Harini, who's going to describe the model we've built.
Yeah, so for our initial pass at a classification model with the data that we collected, we grouped the feminicide subcategories into an overall feminicide class. And there were a couple of reasons for this. First, we don't currently have enough labeled examples to build separate models for these more granular categories or train with them as distinct classes. And from our conversations with activists, these examples are all examples they would want to look at. So when thinking about how this would actually be used, it makes sense to include them in the feminicide category so our model learns to flag them. We still believe that labeling the data in the more granular way is useful though, since it allows us to better understand our data set and its limitations, and will enable utilizing the labels further down the line once we have more data. So we cleaned the text and vectorized it with TF-IDF and trained a naive Bayes model on 294 articles to predict the probability of feminicide. The overall accuracy of the model on a test set of 100 articles was 81%, and you can see the breakdown of false positives and negatives there in the table. And so besides looking at the overall accuracy, we were interested to think about how effective this could be as part of an activist workflow. So in practice, we want to support their existing processes and make it less mentally taxing and time intensive. So we imagine a model like this could be used as a more effective filter on articles. Rather than look through 20 articles where maybe 50% aren't actually feminicide, for example, if we used a model like this to first sort articles, maybe the vast majority of those 20 would actually be feminicide. That's what you see reflected in the graph on the right. So we looked at a test set of 100 articles and sorted them by the predicted probability of feminicide. And you can see that if an activist was to look at the first 20 in this set, for example, almost all would actually be feminicide. And this is similarly true even for the first 40. So if you go to the next slide, Catherine. Yeah, so continuing with this idea of supporting activist efforts, supporting existing activist efforts, we also think it's important to build the surrounding infrastructure around such a model to make sure it's actually easy to use and helpful in practice. So we're currently designing how this will look in an iterative collaborative process with activist partners. And some of the things that we're thinking about, for example, are an alert system to group and surface the articles detected by our model, taking into account activist preferences for how and when they would like to receive this information, and a browser-based extension for making it easier to actually record the relevant information once they've read a particular article. So now I'll take it back to you, Catherine, to finish.
All right, great. So we don't have time to go over these unanswered questions, but in the paper, we enumerate these unanswered questions and tensions that arise in doing this work. And there's a lot of them, and they're active things that we're thinking about right now. And so for anybody who's interested, we would love to be in touch with you if you're working on something similar, or want to reach out, or if you just want a copy of the paper, which is a very kind of emerging work in progress paper, we're happy to share that as well. And the email address is here on the slide. So yeah, thank you very much.